Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for OUA football. Me and Tom are back on the mics previewing Week 5 in the OUA. Tom, we've obviously highlighted Week 5 in a number of ways. For one, as we've said for a few weeks, and just as a reminder, it's going to be on our Week 5 review podcast, so the episode that comes out after this, where we're going to do some of our midway point check-ins as far as who we think are the leaders or who are the top candidates for some of the major awards, whether our Yates Cup predictions. In case you missed it, me and Tom were both going with the three-peat for Western for this year, whether that's changed at all or perhaps who some dark horse candidates are. So stay tuned for that one. And of course, though it's a 8-game regular season, Week 5, of course, is the sort of symbolic hitting of the midway point, and that's partly why we chose that week, because coming off of this weekend, all these teams have played 4 weeks, 4 games. Tom, what do you kind of think about the fact that, as you've said a number of times, the season is just motoring on by, and of course, as always, how the heck are you doing?
I'm doing well, my man. I am doing well. Yeah, it is going by way too fast. I need this thing to slow the hell down because I am not ready for the regular season to be over, and it is rapidly coming to an end here.
Well, what's so fascinating as well is that this Week 5, Week 4, we were talking about for so long. It lived up to the hype. You almost had an aneurysm on mic, on screen, live here on YouTube, live, whatever. But it rolls so beautifully into this week with the matchups that we get, and as we continue to get going into Week 6, 7, and throughout the rest of the season. As a quick check-in, obviously this is just a man on a screen reading numbers off of a web page, but just as a check-in, going into this week, the standings as we sit right now in the OUA, we have Western, Windsor, and Laurier all at 4-1, Ottawa at 2-1, Guelph 2-2, Carleton and Queens at 1-2, Mac and Waterloo at 1-3, Toronto at 0-3, York at 0-4. Tom, maybe we can go into this in more full as far as which team or which record of team is surprising you the most. I will kind of throw that your way at this point, because what's so fascinating is I was doing a little, and thinking about my picks for this week and kind of looking at how the schedule might look coming off of Week 5. There was a few kind of scenarios, including frankly, 2 scenarios that I think are quite likely, not to blow smoke up my own, thinking that my picks are going to be right. Check my record from last year. I'm actually not too shabby at that. But as far as just where we're sitting right now, what's the biggest surprise looking at those records right now?
Well, I think if we're talking about biggest surprise in terms of what we thought we were going to see at the beginning of the season versus now, it has to be Windsor. Like, it has to be. We didn't think that Windsor was going to come off of this, like the success that they saw last year, so powerfully like they have this year. Even at the best case, yes, we put them in the C tier, but we had them in the B tier at the highest point when we were doing our tiered lists here, thinking that Mac was probably going to pull away with one. Ottawa was probably going to get a handle on them, and they might go 4-4, 5-3 kind of thing. These dudes are 4-0. They're 4-0, and they look real good at 4-0. I have to say that Windsor is probably the biggest surprise. If you had told me everything like that before Week 1, that's for sure what I would have said.
It's a great point. I think for a lot of folks, I think that probably is the one that stands out. It is just so it's a beautiful thing, really, to look at the top of the OUA standards. And the funny thing is, Tom, and you were mentioning this, and I'll leave you to mention the touchdowns accumulated by teams as far as points scored and whatnot. Whether when we get to spoiler alert, the Western Mustang portion of our programming, or just in this little conversation we're having. But, it's Windsor technically in second place because of the points for differential, with Western sitting in first there. But, I was thinking about that because I was looking at the standings. Like I said, I was kind of looking at, who I think is coming out of this game, kind of thinking about 2 little scenarios for our YouTube viewers as Tom goes into the dark and reappears beautifully like magic, just like that. The reality of the situation is, and obviously you think about Queens at 1-2, Mac at 1-3. Those certainly are a bit surprising. But the Windsor one, though, it's where your eye is automatically drawn to just because of the history of that program, and they've obviously been building since 2019 with the Dawn taking over. But I feel like our commentary about this team really wasn't about how good they could be somewhat in a vacuum, though of course sports are never in a vacuum. But going back to this string of weeks that we have coming up, where it's just when it's all said and done, once we hit the midway point of the season, which is where we're at, and proceed into the home stretch, they go on this run where they escape Ottawa with that win that was certainly much closer than folks probably thought it was going to be at the half, when they were up three scores, I think it was. They're hosting Queens this week. They got Western the week after. Laurier after their bye week, and then they finish with York, where frankly 4-0, if we do kind of go back and hindsight and whatever we want to say about it, isn't a crazy thing, I think, for Windsor, even though it feels like the natural thing. I feel like this is where Windsor really shows their mettle in being able to say, okay, you did your business against the team in Ottawa that, we've talked about a ton on last week's preview pod and reviewing it, where go back to last year, and those two clubs are so fun to watch duke it out. And now it's just like, hey, as the saying goes, you got to beat the best to be the best. And it's really their time to shine. So in so many ways, that's exactly, I love that that's where you went with it, because that's where my mind went. But in some ways it's like, it kind of makes sense the way the season is going. I mean, you can say the same thing with Queens when they had Laurier and Western in, as two of their first three opponents, where it's like, man, oh man, that's going to be difficult. But anyways, I just wanted to point that out. Obviously, as we're kind of getting into the midway point, no doubt we'll bring up the standings again following this weekend in our sort of mid-season check-in. But let's get into it, and we'll start with, much like our teams in the OUA are hitting their stride, the OUA schedule makers are hitting their stride in terms of, not that they're doing this on a week-to-week basis, but as we teased them last week, of course, we're looking at a schedule that has 4 1:00 games and 1 4:00 game. As a quick kind of aside, I was going to mention this at the end. Tom and I have been deliberating about going to a game. We're kind of thinking about either Mac at Laurier or York at Guelph, both being the homecomings for Laurier and Guelph. If you're listening, tuning into this before said games, if you want to hit us up in our comments, DMs, send us a message. If you're going to be one of those, you want to say what's up. We're kind of going back and forth on where we might go, but of course, Tom, when we go to these games live, it just means we have to catch up on that much more football after the fact. But we'll start with the first game on the schedule. Ottawa GGs hitting the road to take on the Western Mustangs. Western, obviously, both these teams coming off of very emotional games for a number of reasons. Western, it's the Queens-Western rivalry, the touchdown at the 55, the bomb from the STM connection, Hillock to Magnate Jones to steal victory from the jaws of defeat against the historic rival. Ottawa, the near miraculous comeback against Windsor on their home turf. And, my first thought on this, I'll pass it over to you, is how when we saw these teams duke it out last year, I'm trying to remember, I think it was the last game of the regular season. I believe it was in Ottawa. And, that whole idea of, really showing your mettle, best on best, where I was riding that GG train all year long. And it's like, okay, maybe they don't win it, but here we go. It's a great game. And Western just shut the door on them emphatically. From what we've seen from these two teams this far, this is probably preseason, a game where it's like interesting, but not necessarily our, not to mix up our other tiers, kind of A-tier must-watch, can't-miss type football game. What's your thoughts on this matchup?
Yeah, I thought that going into this season, looking ahead into the schedule, once again, taking a look at this game, this was another game that I had circled as like, wow, like this is going to be a real put up or shut up kind of moment for Ottawa. Let's see what they can do here. It's kind of fallen into the background a little bit with, the struggles that Ottawa has had recently here, but I am still interested to see how Western kind of handles himself here, because while yes, we always talk about other teams and having to go out and play Western and things, they're coming out of something of a bit of a gauntlet here. They had a pretty tight game. Well, they obviously do the thing against York, but they have a tight game against McMaster, followed up immediately by a tight game against Carleton and a nail biter of a finish against Queens, and then playing against an Ottawa team that's always solid. So, we'll see how this Western team can kind of handle that and keep going here. As you kind of alluded to at the start, spoiler alert, they are very good. Somehow in just 4 games, they have managed to score 19 touchdowns. 19. That's quite a fair bit. Yeah. So this offense knows how to score. Evan Hillock is playing some of the best football he's played. Keon Edwards is just a solid Keon Edwards. And it seems like anytime they need somebody else other than the two of them to step up, they miraculously do.
Yeah. And as we, about the Ottawa commentary on this one, it really is offensively a one-trick pony for them. We kind of shared our thoughts on Ryan LeCandro, and looking at his numbers on the season, I mean, he's sitting at a 50% passing percentage completion, 0 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. Really not what rough woof. I didn't quite catch what it is, but either of those terms really does fit the bill. On the other hand, and it's you talk about the matchup between. Well, once again, going back to last year, that matchup was more than just, hey, is Ottawa for real, and can they at least give Western a showing? That was very much who's going to be the OUA MVP, Keon Edwards versus JP Simonkinda. And you know what? Like, I don't doubt that played into a lot of people's minds, where it's like, okay, all right, JP, people have been talking about you all year long. I'm pretty sure at that point, they being the Western Mustangs, had already lost. Help me with his name, the backup running back. He's not with them anymore because of some Edward Renati. Don't do drugs, kids. But we know in this year, Amilcar Polk, we talk about what Keon Edwards is doing. He's sitting at 147 yards per game. And it's not even like you compare it to what Keon's done. Amilcar has 3 more rushes. Now, to Keon's credit, I suppose, if you will, this is just going back to how just disgusting Western's offense has been. Part of the reason and part of the conversation about, well, does the number 1 running back at Western really deserve an MVP? Because you go through the rushing leaders, and though it's not as it's not quite the same as when Wanati was like the 4th leading rusher, but Yazbek has 22 rushes himself, averaging 65 in this game. But, here's where, I think that this game will be really interesting, because one of my comments in that Queens game was when we saw Max von Muhldorfer go out, and Queens obviously with a very formidable running attack of their own, saying, okay, whatever our game plan was, and obviously they did want to run it a fair bit, though of course Vreeken threw it like 45 times, whatever it was okay, they lost big number 55 in the middle. That's where we got to attack it. Not knowing his status, you have to imagine that even a banged up von Muhldorfer, that Ottawa's game plan, somewhat, regardless of that fact, is already going to be, we're going to feed Amilcar Polk the ball. With him being out, I feel like that's their only route to victory in this one, is if they can just say, hey, you have yourself the day of all days. But where the rubber meets the road on this one is right now Western's defense, specifically in the rushing ranks, sits at first, giving up only 51 yards per game. Something's got to give there. What do you see being more realistic? And of course, maybe it's somewhere in the middle in terms of, does Amilcar Polk's 147 average a game come a bit more down to earth this week? Or are we going to see a team, kind of hitting the midway point of the year, actually get a good rushing game against Western? Or maybe I'll frame it like this. Does Amilcar get held under 100, or does a team finally get a single back rushing for over 100 on them?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. If I'm the defensive coordinator here going into this game, watching everything that I've seen so far from Ottawa, my game plan, I'm going to load up against the run and force Lacandro to beat me. I don't think that he showcased at the very least that he has the capabilities to do so. And sure, you might give up a whole bunch of quick slant routes, hook routes, ins and outs, and whatever. But if you can limit Polk to under 100 yards, even under like 90 yards, there's a very strong possibility that regardless of what Lacandro does, you win this game. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Riley McLeod get a whole bunch of tackles on Polk this game and really just disrupt this Ottawa GG's offensive line however he can. So I'm going to hazard on the side that Western continues this streak of not having a rusher over 100 yards. The other thing you have to remember is that the last game that they had, they played against Queens, Anthony Souls, Jared Kasari. Like, those aren't just whatever backs. Those are some of the best running backs that we have in the OUA. And still, that's the average for this Western team. So it's not like they've got a magic crystal ball or whatever the case. This team is just damn good at stopping the run, and I think that continues on into this week.
Yeah, and you know what? You mentioned Riley McLeod's name, and we'll obviously talk about Defensive Player of the Year candidates and things like that, and with how part of I feel like for DPOY, there's the individual performance, and then there's also how well you play within a system that can be so incredible. I mean, I think in many ways, the Daniel Valente Jr. Winning it last year was not that he isn't fantastic, but that defense is fantastic. He's kind of the captain of that defense. You give it to him, whether or not some of us might have disagreed, though not taking any shots at Valente Jr. himself, where, thinking about going back to last year where you had, we obviously talked about the MVP battle, but then, of course, James Peter being the person I was alluding in that of like, who else could be this candidate? On the Ottawa side of things, another linebacker who's been balling out for them, and Max Carbonneau, being someone who, he's at the top of the leader tackles so far. He's actually tied with the 18-year-old phenom Ethan Gregorcic, but, a guy who's obviously, similarly part of a defense that overall is really strong. Obviously that, the number they gave up against Windsor was a little big, though, of course, some penalties, some, fumbled punt situations kind of put them in a precarious situation. So this will be an interesting one for us, I think, coming off of this game in terms of the commentary we're going to have about some of the names we want to talk about as far as DPO wise, not just a function of just like, wow, actually, like if we come out of this being like, man, Amilcar still rushed for 110, something like that, where we're like, oh boy, that's really something, or whatever it might be. Obviously, there's other great pieces in that Ottawa defense, and we saw a couple of them, especially in the secondary, go down. We saw that defense, though, do a really good job as far as in the front four, slowing down the Windsor rushing attack. Of course, Windsor leading the league as far as collective rushing. But that's the thing with this Western team. Like, Keon's having... It's crazy to even say this for the reigning MVP, like a sneaky, really good season. Part of that is because, hey, when you win MVP, it's the classic, like, the sophomore curse or whatever you want to call it, Madden curse, things like that, where it's like when you have an exceptional, outstanding year at any point in your career, it's just gonna be hard to even touch that, let alone exceed it. So by point of comparison, it might seem lesser. But even if, once again, Keon's having not the MVP season he had last year, even though, of course, that's where I threw my hat in the ring in our preseason predictions, part of it certainly is because of our boy Evan Hillock doing his thing. And if Ottawa's secondary isn't healed up from where they were at last week, talk about what Ottawa can do rushing the ball. Von Muhldorfer still out. Man, oh man, I guess I'll just pass it to you like this, having set that up. What do you think I mean, and it'll probably just be a well-rounded attack like it normally always is. But, and we'll get into our picks momentarily. But when you think about what Western might do to attack the GGs, do you see it more at the hands of Hillock, or do you think that they're going to just try and, Keon had his most prolific game last week, keep riding that to make sure that he's really hitting his stride to have the full, well-rounded orchestra of an offense?
Yeah, I think with this Western team, with the amount of weapons that they have on offense, it's still going to be somewhat well balanced. I think that what we have kind of seen it, but I don't think we've actually outright said as of yet, is that this year, in comparison to last year, the pass for Western is setting up the run. Like, Mac goes into this game in week 2 completely set up, no chance. Keon Edwards not going to rush on us, whatever. And Hillock goes off against them. And it's not even that like they have to switch the game plan up. You and I watched that game. Western comes out just throwing the ball. They are trying to get McMaster out of that defense of theirs and then start feeding Keon the ball. And I think that's kind of been the case throughout these games that are here. We know that the Western rushing attack is always solid. It is every single year. So we're going to load up the box. We're going to really make sure that it's hard to run here. And then Hillock goes off for 300 plus yards per game that he has been doing here. And spoiler alert, not only is he leading the OUA in touchdowns, he's leading U Sports in passing touchdowns this entire year so far. So they are very dangerous in the air, and I can't remember the last time that a Western offense had their pass setting up the run to kind of get this thing going here. I think especially with the injuries that we saw on Ottawa, even if everybody does come back, I think Western's game plan going into this is going to be through the air. How can we make this GG's team pay? Especially at the fact, you kind of called it out, that front four last game against Windsor played fantastic. They really did. They got a lot of pressure on Skelton. They were in the backfield quite a fair bit with the run game. And I expect to see the same thing going into this year as well. So if I'm Western, I'm definitely trying to gear up for a passing attack here, and I'm not really sweating it all that much. No discredit to Ottawa by any means, because they are very good, but Evan's been doing this all year so far, and he's going to continue doing this. When you look at the U Sports statistics individual leaders, Evan Hillock leads the league in passing touchdowns at 12. You've got Mohsen Jamal, who leads the league in yards per game with 100, and Seth Robertson, who leads the league in passing touchdowns with 6. So 3 Western Mustang offensive players, all of them to do with the passing game, leading all of U Sports in their specific categories. They go through the air and they get it done.
Yeah, and by get it done, I'm assuming you mean pick up the win in this game.
Yeah, they're going to be 5-0.
I'm gonna agree with you on that one, and you mentioning the performance of Jamal and Robertson on the year, and obviously we saw Seth Robertson have some good performances last year as well in the Yates, especially. What's so amazing, and just we've both coached yourself at quite a high level, where particularly with quarterbacks, when they have a connection with a guy, the way that Evan does with Savon, where you often, you sometimes have a coaching point of being like, no, you know what? You can throw the whole route tree to Magne Jones in your sleep. We're not worried about that. That's going to be there in late November, or whenever, however long the Mustang season takes them. It'll be there. Kind of that whole point of using the season at many times to get other aspects of your offense going. You have to, if you're a Mustang fan, love what Mohsen Jamal and what Seth Robertson are doing. As you said, I mean, I'm sure Savon's not terribly far behind on those rankings as well, but just the fact that, that STM connection is going to be there when they need it. They can go to the well when they want to, much like we talked with Windsor, trying to develop the passing game a little bit, knowing that if they need to go back to the run game, it's always going to be there. So yeah, this will be a fun game, and to use a turn of phrase, a play on words, I suppose, that I've used a few times going back to Trey Ford's award-winning season in 2021. That Evan Hillock's having a heck of a season so far. Let's go on to our next game.
Sorry,
also at
just
1 o'clock. Oh,
quickly before we
yes.
go into the next game, I just wanted to add into that. I didn't even necessarily notice it because I was just looking for the top. Second in passing yards per game, that would be Savon Magny Jones at 93.3. And third in receiving touchdowns, that would also be Savon Magny Jones with 3 touchdowns. So, yeah, they're pretty good.
Yeah, no, they do the football well. Let's go to our next 1 o'clock game. And, speaking of passing attacks, this is definitely where my commentary, my thinking is on this one, because it is the Laurier homecoming game where they'll be hosting your McMaster Marauders. Laurier coming off of, such a phenomenal showing these past 2 weeks for, the Golden Hawks offense led by Taylor Elgersma has been so spectacular. For Mac, this massive disappointment, whether they were literally looking past the Guelph game as we kind of speculated, or at least had that feeling knowing that this matchup was going to come up, just a major blip on the radar. And as we said, I feel like the fate of our fate, or the fate of McMaster and Guelph being our alma maters, is to just torture us throughout the year, because I do feel like Mac will have a much better outing despite going up against, no offense to Guelph, despite what they showed last week, a significantly better opponent in Laurier. But here's where I want to get it started. And, it seems like a theme now, even coming off of their big win against York. Tom, you're saying we need to see something of a run game going. Just that whole idea of a well-rounded offense. And I'm over here being like, well, yeah, but they kind of won a Yates 4 years ago, not really running the ball. And then we see what they do, or we see what happens to them last week, where, and we're certainly going to get into some commentary soon about how Guelph played them defensively, where they're getting home, them Guelph Griffins are, with 3 guys up front and just sitting back and just not letting anything beat them big over the top. I mean, we certainly know though Laurier plays a more standard 40 front defense, they'll get home with the best of them. I don't have the sack leaders in front of me right now. I mean, we know we've been talking about how Windsor's been up there with the best of them. I mean, Windsor's been above and beyond where anyone's been at. Waterloo's had a really good year getting to the quarterback, seemingly on the back of Tyson Hergott. Queens with Van Wisher, what he's been doing, but we know the names at Laurier. Like, we know who's there rushing the passer. But when it's all said and done, the thing that I was kind of looking at with this game, because we talk about how despite last week, how prolific Keegan Hall's been performing, passing the ball, and that's really you talk about one-trick ponies going back to Ottawa and rushing the ball. With what Mac's been doing so far this year in terms of their passing yards per game, they're sitting second, just 2 measly yards between Heck Crichton candidate Evan Hillock's Western Mustangs air raid, with 335 passing yards per game. And what really surprises me the most is that when you look at the flip side of that coin, Laurier is giving up the second most passing yards per game at 270. Now, I will pass it to you on that comment. The only other thing is that, like, the sort of caveat, the thing that perhaps qualifies that is that when you win a game 47-20 last week, and then you win a game 60-21 the week before, guess what teams are going to do against you? They're going to throw the damn ball. So it literally might be that simple, but that's really the only thread, aside from, of course, the obvious commentary anyone can make about, well, if so-and-so gets hurt, or if like random turnovers and things like that. That's seemingly the only possibly logical thread I can pull on, and being like, where could Mac attack this team, even if it is just the case that the last 2 weeks, Laurier's opponents have just, because of the deficit they have gotten behind, have just had to throw the rock. What are you thinking about with this game? Has your heart rate settled down since last Saturday in that game against Guelph? The floor is yours, Senator.
I appreciate it. Yes, my heart rate is back to normal after a tumultuous week, we'll call it. Yeah, I am. So there's a lot of things going into this game, and I think this one is probably number 2 in terms of the most exciting games that are going to be happening this weekend. There's a lot of questions that I have about obviously this McMaster team. And I went into something of a rant of it earlier this week. And I'm not even necessarily saying you need to start running the ball a little bit more. You need to start switching up the offense in some way, shape, or form, because just continuously going back to the well and standard 3-step drops with Mr. Keegan Hall is not going well. You very much struggled against a 30 front defense from before, and credit to those guys at Guelph. They obviously played well. I don't think any one of them is better than Luke Brubaker at getting to the quarterback. And you're going to have to deal with that dude all game long. I think that's going to be a real deciding factor in terms of how this McMaster team comes out against Laurier, knowing that the pass rushers are there, knowing that if Laurier didn't blitz once, there's still a strong possibility that they could end up with 6 or 7 sacks if you're not careful. So I think if you're McMaster, you're going into this trying to make them hesitate in some way, shape, or form. You don't really have the run game in order to do a play fake and keep them honest, because, Daniel Bossett, for as good as he is, hasn't really been able to get anything done on the ground here. So I think the way that you keep this Laurier defense honest is that you have to go into your quick passing game. Slants, swing routes, things of that nature, just to try and get these guys off their heels a little bit here and try to keep everybody honest is probably going to be your best bet. Now, if you're throwing a slant route, into the middle, you are throwing them directly into Onyemenum. And how much do you love your receivers if you're just setting that dude up to crush them over the middle? But I think that's going to be your best bet here. And even, you don't have the idea of a run play fake, but you have, maybe it's a pump fake to a slant route and then a seam down the middle to Jackson Cooling that gets you your big play opportunities, continuing with this idea of an air raid offense. Now, on the Laurier side of things, yes, sure. Like you said, they're second in the league right now in terms of passing yards allowed. But exactly like you said, Waterloo, like we said, finishes with 400 yards of total offense at the end of that game. And a lot of it, like you said, comes in garbage time after Laurier is up so big. They play against a Queens team that is very good. And Alex Vreeken, despite his own struggles, throws for a bunch there. Tristan Lefebvre does his thing with Carleton as well. So it's not like these passing yards are just kind of out of the blue here. There's a rhyme or reason to it. I think that this is, in my opinion, not Western, this is Mac's biggest test going into this week. How Laurier stacks up against this Marauder team. I think they're very, very well set to stop the Marauders in almost every aspect of this. I think McMaster's defense is going to do a great job of trying to stop the run as well, but Elgersma with how he is playing, and I'm going into a big rant here because I'm just so damn excited about this game. But yeah, this is the test for these Marauders up to this point.
Yeah, well, you brought up a lot of good points in that, and I'll piggyback off of you bringing up Mac's defense there at the tail end, because obviously it was Donovan Malloy having the most outstanding game offensively for Guelph. Obviously, we talked about how well Tristan Abou did that end of the game drive. Finishing when he hits Janusis in the end zone, them still working in McRae in that sort of run look at the quarterback position. So it was in many ways, it was a well-rounded offensive attack by Guelph, but I think we've seen enough from Mac so far this year to still trust in the guys that they have there. You brought up Coach Brady's name just as far as coordinating that defense and the trust that you have in the system. And what I'm most fascinated about is I think Deshaun posted on Persevere what Elgersma's like, when you combine the Waterloo and the Guelph stats, just as far as like a 2-game bender he's gone on of putting up, like, I mean, off the top of my head, like was it like 11 touchdowns in 2 games, like probably like 600 yards passing or something?
He is number 2 in all of U Sports, and essentially just over 2 games.
Like that's bananas, right? And I think about this MAC defense, and once again, the coordinator, is a dude. You got guys like, Devontae Ballentine, Nana Yaserbe. You got a guy Josh Cumber in the mix, Teo Smith. A lot of these good secondary players, and perhaps even a few guys that I'm missing. Just kind of thinking about a few off the top of my head there. And then you think about, once again, like what was so crazy talking about the Waterloo game for them is that Thorne and Jordan don't find it into the end zone, and they just, are managing to score points in every which other way. And of course, we know what they can do on the ground as well. I'm so immensely curious what Laurier's plan offensively is, because in so many ways they are entering that Western territory of. And once again, it's not to say that Western doesn't game plan. Part of the reason they are so great is because Greg Marshall is the best, and he's always had a great staff. You have to look no further than some of the head coaches on other teams in the OUA to further validate that if you have any questions about that. But when they have such trust in their system where they're like, well, yeah, maybe we get our advantage running this against so-and-so opponent, but realistically, you can have it this way or you can have it that way. And frankly, we don't give a darn how we serve it up to you because we know we are that good. And so it's just getting to that point where, like, going back to some commentary I brought up earlier, specifically talking about, with Windsor, the commentary we've talked about this year of, we know that run game's good. Let's see them really establish that passing game. Laurier's already at that point. And so each and every week, it becomes such a joy to watch them, to be able to see just what they want to do. Like literally, like I feel like they're sitting around right now in their offensive meetings, like, Galway and Falls being like, you want to rush for like 200 yards this week? Yeah. All right, sick. Let's do it. All right, 1, 2, 3, break. Like, should we just continue? Those guys are talking about like Evan being the Hec Crate candidate, award candidate, which means that they think he might be winning the MVP. Should we shut that down and continue this unreal streak that our guy Elgersman is going on? Okay, let's do that. All right, 1, 2, 3, break. And then on top of all that, you have Battle of Waterloo that they hosted last week. And of course, the sort of majesty and the excitement of that. And then this being their homecoming as well, where like, I don't really know how that all factors in, what kind of pixie dust that adds into the mix and whatnot. But each and every week is just such a joy to tune into this team because of how fantastic they are. With that in mind, like how we've seen Mac be exposed perhaps in certain areas, or not exposed, but how we've seen other teams try to move the ball on them to lesser and greater success. Where do you think, though of course I do believe, like I just said, Laurier, if they wanted to, could run it, could pass it, they'll probably do both. Where do you think that Mac is probably on their end trying to think, hey, this is where we are perhaps the most vulnerable to such and such a attack from the Laurier Golden Hawks offensively?
Well, when you look at McMaster and the defensive side of things throughout this season so far, they have played very well against a extremely talented Western Mustang defense. They only let up 20 some odd points, because the last touchdown, the game sealing one, was the pick 6 that Keegan Hall threw. So knowing the fact that Evan has thrown 12 touchdown passes this year so far and only throws 2 against McMaster, I think we're already starting to see some bright spots for this Marauder defense. I think in every single game, McMaster has been in it with the opportunity to win because of their defense. I have a lot of confidence and a lot of faith in Scott Brady as that defensive coordinator, as I've said before, and I think he's going to do a hell of a job doing a great game plan out for Laurier here. My biggest question mark for this McMaster defense is, how do you continue to stay up, and how do you continue to have your positivity, knowing that you did your job and you still lost the game? You limited Western to under 4 scores, and you lost the game because of a pick six. Now, I don't want to throw that all on Keegan Hall because, once again, we talk about the air raid style offense here. If you're giving it to Hall to throw 40 times a game on average, it's going to happen here. And especially when teams are realizing that we can get pressure with 3 or 4, we're going to just keep everybody else in the back end and outnumber you. So I don't want to give any, unnecessary criticism to Keegan Hall that way. But as this defense, I'm sure at some point you're looking across the way being like, we have a very strong possibility of potentially being 5-0 going into this game with a game-saving touchdown drive against Western, and the amount of opportunities that they had against Windsor and even Guelph here. They have a very real possibility, of being 4-0 so far if the offense is able to get a little bit more production. So how do you continue to remain that solid, cohesive unit and not look over and be like, guys, you got to do something for us here? Like, if we're going to limit Taylor Elgersma, who's arguably playing like the OUA MVP in just 2 games of real coverage, how do you win this game without this offense scoring at least 3 or 4 touchdowns against Laurier? Because you're not going to hold them to 0. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And you brought up the idea of maybe this is where Mac says, hey, players meeting, coming off that Guelph game. Cause you talking about that sort of enmity that can arise if one side of the ball isn't sort of pulling their weight, or if you just have that disparity. And hey, most teams are going to be slanted one way or the other. Obviously, as we said, it's not the case for, say, Laurier. But once those kind of whispers start happening in a team, and the offense goes 3 and out, and the defense is kind of jogging onto the field after the punt, going holy moly, come on, guys. That's when the season's lost. And I don't think they're there, because I believe in the motivator and the leader that Coach Ptacek is. And as you said, there's a case for them having won all their games right now. But of course, we're not talking horseshoes in this case. But Tom, I want to throw it to you this way, right? Because as we often do when we talk about a various number of things in OUA football, just looking at defenses in the league. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's remove the York Lions from the conversation because they sit at the bottom of nearly every category. When you look at yards given up per game, the bottom 3 in the OUA in terms of defenses are the Guelph Griffins, the Carleton Ravens, and the Waterloo Warriors. Tom, what do all 3 of those teams have in common? Perhaps a number of things, but can you name me one aspect that unites those 3 teams with those defenses being being situated where they are in the rankings right now?
Putting me on the spot. I have no idea.
They all played Laurier. Right? And so on the flip side, you look at a team in Mac who sits at 4th in terms of 324 yards given up per game. Like I said, that leaves them at 4th. They've only given up 19 points per game. And that's kind of the thing where it's like, hey, that MAC defense has been really good. But as we said, hey, maybe that Guelph defense, when healthy, is actually really good. Carleton, kind of like their defense. Waterloo, we kind of like their defense as well. But they all had to play Laurier. And so they have to wear that on their record. They have to wear that in how it shows up on the stats. I'll pump the brakes slightly, though, because, of course, Laurier's first victory came against Queens. Queens sits in 3rd in terms of yards per game. They've only given up an average of 10 points per game. I mean, we know Queens' defense is spectacular, and that's partly why that week 1 matchup was so phenomenal. But that just stands out to me when you look at, like I said, take York out of the conversation there. The 3 teams that sit at the bottom in terms of yards they've given up per game, at least one common through line with those teams is they've played Laurier. So if you're those teams, like if you're Guelph, Carleton, and Laurier, you have to be Guelph, Carleton, and Waterloo. You have to be like, let's remove the Laurier game from how we assess our own capabilities. And once again, when we get to Guelph shortly, they very much perhaps took that to heart in some meaningful ways. Nonetheless, Tom, I think I have expressed all my thoughts, comments, and queries about this game so far. Anything left from you before we dial in our picks?
No, it's funny because you look at everything that we kind of heard from Mr. Mad Jack Moore in terms of where this Laurier team would be. And after 2 weeks, we're like, yeah, they're pretty good, but I don't know, Jack, are you really? And then these past two were like, oh no, yeah, Jack knows what he's doing. He knows Laurier football. Oh my goodness, like the drastic step forward that this offense has been taking here is insane. And it doesn't matter of I should say the caliber of defense that they are playing against comes into factor, certainly in terms of, you can make an argument that the drastic increase in terms of the production that we've seen from this Laurier offense. Guelph really, really struggled in their game, and obviously they played against Waterloo, which we believe is a better defense than is showing on the stat line, but I don't think either of us would say they're a top 5 defense in the league here. So I don't think that even if they're playing against a top tier team, that this kind of coming out party for Elgersma and the rest of this offense doesn't happen. I think that this is always going to happen. They just needed a little bit more time to gel and get things going here. But now that they have played against these other teams where they had a lot of success, I think that the confidence is there. And more importantly, the chemistry is really there. Regardless of what you wanted to say, obviously they had that chemistry last year as well. They've done it. Now they've done it in games. We played against Guelph. We played against Waterloo. And in those 2 games, Taylor Elgersma has 11 passing touchdowns. These guys know that they can be dangerous. They know that they can score off the drop of a hat here. And I think that this is probably one of, if not the most dangerous offense in the OUA right now. Just of how they're playing, how Quentin Scott's kind of coming into his own as well, being a really solid running back. I love everything that I'm seeing from this Laurier team. If I'm McMaster, we talked a little bit last time about mentality. If you're the Marauders here, you've got to have the mentality of a cornered raccoon. You are, this is desperation mode right now. You are playing to save your season.
Yeah.
If everything works out how we think it's going to, you're going to come out of this 1-4 and need to run the table to finish 4-4 and hopefully limp into the playoffs. If you win this game, once again, I still think you need to run the playoffs, run the table, but you finish at 5-3. World leagues better than 4-4. You still own your destiny here. On paper, you own your destiny. How are you going to respond? How are you going to respond to everything else that's happened here? How are you going to come out against this team? If you come out in the same lackadaisical kind of mentality that at least us as fans have seen when watching this game, this is going to get ugly very, very quickly. So I'm interested to see what happens here. This is a gut check time for these Marauders. If they don't have a strong game against Laurier, regardless if they win or lose, you might as well pack it in right now.
Well, gut check performance or not, I'm taking Laurier at home on their homecoming against your Marauders, Tom. You can pick with your heart, you can pick with your head, you can mix them up together and spit some combination out, but who are you taking in this matchup?
No, with everything that I have seen here, it's Laurier. And it's a very strong possibility of Laurier big. So, McMaster, for once in one of these picks that I'm calling, prove me wrong, please. Prove me wrong in the right way rather than the wrong way like you have a couple of times this year so far.
No, Tom, honestly, picking against your alma mater is the best feeling because you get it. You're right either way. Either you're right on the pick or you're wrong on the pick, but they win on the scoreboard. And I'll probably bring this up again on the next pod when we talk about sort of our midway season check-in, where with Laurier, the way their season breaks out, and they have a gauntlet to end the season. And I will run through those games quickly, but we go back to that opening game. They sneak out of Kingston with the 11-10 victory. The following week, they open up at home. They win 20-15 against Carleton. Carleton kind of, giving us all a wake-up call of being like, oh, nice. All right, Carleton's a team this year. That's sick. I mean, once again, they were 5-3 last year, but they left a lot to be desired. And then they do their thing against Guelph. They do the thing against Waterloo. We're both thinking they're winning this game. They go into their bye week at 5-0, and then they end their season where they host Windsor. Or pardon me, they go to Ottawa, they host Windsor, and they go to Western. And so, like on paper thus far this year, they're certainly the favorite over Ottawa. I think that if you're really, it might be a tight margin, but it's them, Windsor and Western then become kind of those top three teams. And so how they kind of finish those games out will be so great. But partly the reason I was even bringing all that up is that they have those first two games at home, or probably on the road and at home, where they're in tight ball games and they're able to kind of demonstrate that moxie, that savvy to kind of take care of business in a tight ball game. And then they do the thing where the offense explodes and all that. We'll see how this one shakes out this weekend. I'm in agreement with what you said. It could get ugly again, and just the way that not only they can beat you in every which way, but they've demonstrated that they can win games in every which way so far this year. So it's just it's such an impressive team, and it's been such a joy to watch them. Let's move on to our next game, where we have just mentioned them, the Carleton Ravens at home taking on the U of T Blues, coming off of their bye week. And when we went through the schedule, we're talking about, we went through the standings, which team's kind of surprising you the most. And obviously, as we said going into Carleton's game against York last week, where they certainly played better than the 0-2 record, it was a no doubt pick for them on the road against the Lions and everything like that. They're sitting at 1-2 right now. So in many ways, despite the record, they're playing above that. With Toronto at 0-3, even coming off the bye, it's just I'm struggling to think of my commentary on this one. I was sitting here just like staring at the names on the screen for quite a while, just trying to think of what do I think of this matchup? Because the quick and dirty of it is Carleton's the better team, and they're at home. And as far as my pick goes, yeah, frankly, it is going to be that simple. And really, we've talked about what we've seen from Tristan Lefebvre and like what he's been doing. Kasim Ferdinand's been having a really nice season. Some of these other receivers for the Ravens have been performing really well. And of course, it's a really fun defense to watch with the speed they have, with Ife Onyeka as kind of that star on the defensive line for them, and a couple other dudes that have been, making them a formidable matchup. Once again, go back to that Laurier game they had in week 2 when they opened up their season, and just seeing what they can do. So I don't know. I guess the only thing, once again, kind of trying to find that thread of what makes this slightly more interesting than me sitting here being like, yeah, we're at the midway point of the year. Carleton's the better team. They're at home. It's, like a 6-hour drive for the Blues. Yeah, they're coming off the bye week, but we haven't really seen, much signs of life from them. That one thread might be, well, that was kind of what we thought when Carleton went to go visit Toronto last year. And then Toronto came away with that, beautiful victory at home under the lights at Varsity Stadium. So I don't know. And as we kind of talked about in breaking down the York Carleton game, we never need to spend more time than we have to on these games. But what thoughts do you have that make this more interesting than it's just the tale of a better team playing a team that so far has not shown to live up to what we thought they could be?
I think that this has the makings to be an actually very entertaining game. I think coming off of a bye week, going in and playing against Carleton, this is going to be the best that we see from these Toronto Blues. I really think so. I think they're going to be prepped to all hell, making sure that they're doing everything that they can to be as prepared as possible. And every single player on that team, with maybe the exception of the first year players, still has that feeling of having a coming out party and winning against Carleton when no one thought that you were going to do that last year. So I think going into this one, having the bye week and having that knowledge of what you did last year, I wouldn't be surprised if the Toronto Blues team is walking into this game being like, we can do this. There is a very strong possibility that we can win here. We've done it before, and that whole narrative. Whether or not they actually do is another story here. I think Tristan Lefebvre is quietly playing some of the best quarterback, having some of the best quarterback play in the OUA right now. I know that obviously he's being outshined by other just monsters that we have in the league right now, but he is playing very well for these Carleton Ravens. I think obviously they come out and get a big win against York. They've got some confidence here going into this. I say that Carleton is still going to continue to work on building towards where they want to be. And, you don't ever want to start thinking about looking past an opponent, because that's where you get into a lot of trouble here. But going up and playing against York and doing what you do, and then playing against Toronto that has the capabilities of really, establishing yourself once again, the next week is Panda, baby. So it's very, very important to obviously come off of a high here and make sure that you're doing everything you can, regardless of what happens. But you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to get prepared for arguably the biggest game of the season for this Carleton Raven team. And like I said, I don't want to look forward into next week. I still think that there's a very strong possibility that we finally see Kinsale wake up and do his thing. And wake up's not the right term, because I don't think it's any lack of his own efforts. I think he needs some more support around him to try to help out with this Toronto offense. But regardless, coming off of the bye week, going into Carleton, a team that they won against last year, I think that this is the best that we see from this Toronto Blues team going into this one.
And you're probably right. Even if only by virtue of, you got the bye week, so you have an extra time to prepare for the singular opponent and everything like that. And in the spirit of, oh, sorry, I was looking ahead 2 weeks. I thought the Argo Cup was the same week of Panda as well. Looking ahead too far on that one. But, I think if you're Carleton, the thing that really surprises me, and talk about feeding a dead horse over here, broken record or whatever. It's like, come on, Josh Ferguson, man, what's going on? Because the thing is, though, is that this kind of theme of teams doing what they can do really well and to pick up wins. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about, right? Doing what you do best, and if that plays into your hand of also taking advantage of deficiencies, if you will, of the opposing team, and then it's like, well, then yeah, 100% that's what you're gonna do. Like, there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. But the thing, when I look at this matchup as far as what Toronto's done so far defensively, and got to caveat it, they had to play Ottawa already. We know what a phenom Almacar Polk is, but they sit second behind York in terms of their average of rushing yards given up per game, right? And so on the one hand, you think, hey, Tristan Lefebvre, that really strong receiving core he has, they can win you this game. You're at home, all those things. Maybe the UFT offense wakes up a little bit more, but on the whole, you feel confident your defense will shut it down. We always kind of say with Carleton, like, they usually have an explosive play on special teams every week. Going back now, I feel like almost 3 years now, even dating back to the year before Coach Grant got there. But the thing is, though, is that that whole idea of, let's see if you can round out your offense. And, well, you'd think that if that was going to happen, we'd have seen it last week with the run game. And it didn't happen, right? And, of course, York is sitting at the bottom of the barrel in terms of rush yards per game, giving up 348 per game. And the thing that blows my mind the most is, like I said, Toronto's above them by obviously a good margin, like in many stats. Shout out to York, go Lions, meow. But, like, as far as team rushing, offensive efficiencies, York at least can hold over Carleton that they have they average 4 more yards a game than the Ravens. It blows my mind and knocks my socks off. Like, the Ravens are averaging 58 yards per game on the ground. You talk about wanting to see more out of your McMaster Marauders. They're the third lowest with 77 per game. So, not great either. We've talked about that enough already this year, where it's like, just, gosh, like, come on. Just, like, I just want them to say, we are just, and maybe it's not, maybe it won't be at the hands of of Josh Ferguson. Because, going back to the York game, even though on the whole, it wasn't a terribly prolific rushing game, it's Matthew Morin with 80 yards rushing. Ferguson with 78 right behind him. You got Alex Gale actually at 51 there. So what was the total there? I mean, hey, net rush for 263. At least they did their thing against York rushing the ball. That would have been a real red flag. The totality of the year, though, I mean, it's still, it's so, for a team that's been showing so many positive things, that's the one thing where I almost want them to say, Tristan, I'm sorry, brother. On the first half, you are handing off the rock and nothing else. Mm-hmm. If we find ourselves in a tighter ball game than we feel comfortable, then hey, you know what? Let's start getting it out to our dudes. But I want to see them get that going. But at the same time, and I'll kind of pass it off to you on this one, because also former offensive lineman, you've coached offensive line at the U Sports level in the OUA, where don't know all the names of the guys on that O line, and it could be scheme, could it be personnel, could it be any number of things, where it's just like, hey, even if they put up nice numbers against Toronto like they did against York, could there just be something fundamentally sort of at hand here with this run game? Or maybe is it more just kind of like the Mac situation where they're like, we're just really comfortable spreading the ball through the air, and that's really all it comes down to. As a former coach in the OUA on the offensive line, when you watch this team, does it feel more like they go to the air out of that comfort, or is it out of necessity?
Well, we kept going back to, when we talked about McMaster, hey, they won a Yates Cup with an air raid offense. Who was the offensive coordinator at that time? That would be Coach Corey Grant. Yeah. So I think that naturally you have a head coach who is already predisposed to being more of a passer than anything else. And right now it seems like when you look at this team on paper, yes, you and I have both been very big supporters of Joshua Ferguson, but you look at, Tristan Lefebvre, who was playing pretty well, the Ferdinand brothers, and like every other potential target that they have on that offensive secondary. Yeah, I would say that their strength lies in the passing game. So I don't think that they're doing this out of necessity. I think that Coach Grant is trying to set up a new culture for this Carleton Raven offense where, yeah, we're going to throw the ball more than we're going to run it. We're going to do the things that the Canada West does in the OUA and help try to reestablish this, idea of exciting offenses here. That's certainly what they did against Western, and they came away with a nail biter there. They didn't win that one. I just want to make sure I'm clarifying that. But they came very close to doing so. So I think if you're Carleton, why would you listen to a couple of guys talking about OUA football here and just say, you know what, screw you guys. We're going to continue throwing in the air. Our rushes per game could be dead last, but as long as our wins per game are higher, I don't really give a care.
And once again, at the end of the day, like, especially now that we're in the midseason point of the season, it's like you are who you are. They've had their bye. They had the week 1 bye. So as far as any wrinkles to your team philosophy, your team culture and things like that become that much harder when you don't have that opportunity to literally say, like, we're going to go to the drawing board, we're going to scheme up some new things, or we're going to whatever it might be. I totally get it. And especially get the point about, like, certainly why would you, I mean, I can make a good case for why they'd be listening to you, why they listen to me. They aren't. No, we'll just get that out of the way. 100%. And who knows? We'll see. I mean, it's one of those things, because at the end of the day, this isn't Carleton's year as far as, where we think of their grand aspirations. And I think often in sports and all sports, we get caught up in thinking like, well, if you're not competing for a chip, then like, what are you doing, right? But of course, when we're talking about collegiate sports, it's all about building. It's all about setting culture. And at the end of the day, you're right. And Coach Grant has a track record that lends itself to the way they're doing it. The team, obviously, like I said, I put out a few feelers trying to get some kind of intel into kind of what's going on in that Ravens, locker room, kind of like what's the word there, just because like I know from afar, I through my computer screen. I dig the mojo. So you're right. At the end of the day, whatever it is, I feel like it is working. It's just that thought that we've talked about, that you want to be able to see a team where you can do it on all angles. But of course, referencing, going back to, you kind of threw my own logic against me, going back to that 2019 Yates Cup with Mac, with Coach Grant, there clearly was a recipe for success that involved doing similar things to what they're doing here. Hey, despite what you said about maybe we get a better outing from U of T, and maybe this is the Kinsale Phillip breakout game for the 23 season. As we've said now for 2 weeks, I like what Carleton's doing. I love what they're showing on both sides of the ball. And like we said, hey, Ottman Braum will probably have, another big return and maybe put up a touchdown as well. And maybe we'll see Denny Ferdinand step on the field for the Ravens, which is obviously, thinking about the long-term success of this team with both those brothers being in year 3, is certainly part of the recipe if next year becomes the year where we're talking about them contending for the Yates. Anyways, it's Carleton at home in this one. Tom?
Ravens flock, baby.
Love it. Well, let's go from the nation's capital to the Royal City, where the Guelph Griffins will be hosting the York Lions. And, as we said, Tom, you and I, we're deliberating. Maybe we'll go to this game. I don't know if Guelph wants me at any of their games. This is more a little bit I have prepared here for folks tuning in online, but, I'm prepared, though, for if anyone wants to, sling any arrows my way. I got my Griffin hard hat on right now, with, of course, 55 on the front. So I might have to roll into Alumni Stadium rocking this lovely piece of hardware that Coach Brown gave a bunch of us at the Stu Lang reunion dinner last week to, in case anyone says, hey, there's that bald asshole from at the 55. Let's get him. That would assume that those folks know who I am in the first place. But, hey, more props for our segment here. Go Griffs. Great showing by Guelph last week. We now have 2 weekends in a row going back to, the loss against Laurier, despite how that outcome was, where the offense is really coming into its own. And, the thing about, let me get this Griffin off my shoulder. For our podcast listening group, I just had a stuffed animal Griffin on my shoulder. We've talked a bit about when we looked at Laurier and where their passing defense ranks, and it seems odd because their numbers are quite high and they rank quite low. But then you might have that aspect of, well, when you get up big on teams, yada, yada, yada. For Guelph, it was early in that game that we were talking about where it's like, hey, they're moving the ball. Obviously, then we see what they do against your Marauders last week for seemingly a good 4 quarters and kind of finding this identity. Obviously, this will be, there'll be just ridiculous numbers across the board for them this week with York. I think we're saying, I believe it's their homecoming as well. It'll be a beautiful day, all the pageantry and things like that. Guelph certainly knows how to put on a show at Alumni Stadium. I guess, and for Guelph, like we said, then they go into Waterloo, and some interesting things about that one. I guess in terms of building on their mojo, both offensively, defensively, and actually, I totally forgot. That's where we need to start with this one. But before we kind of, whether we segue right into that one or whatever, in a game where Guelph can obviously, have success doing whatever they want, no offense, York, in terms of trying to build off of the things we saw last week that were so great, and even some things, at least on the offensive side, going back to Laurier, that were positive. What do you want them to see against the team that obviously they can do whatever they want to, seemingly, to keep building on that?
Well, offensively, I certainly want them to continue doing what they were doing and where they saw some success against these Marauders here. One of the things that I'm actually most looking forward to is certainly obviously getting to see that Guelph Griffins offense and making sure that they're doing everything that they can. But assuming that Guelph takes care of business and they're up big, we might see a full half of Marshall McCray, and not just as the rushing leader for these Guelph Griffins, but actually throwing the ball and seeing what Now, I normally would say something like this: what does the future of Guelph look like? But Tristan is also a first-year player for them. So we'll see. But I am just very interested to see, where does Marshall McRae fit in terms of comparing him to Tristan Aboud here? Is it neck and neck kind of thing, and they just thought that Marshall McRae had a little bit more of an edge as that runner, as that Wildcat style offensive player, and that's where they kind of slotted him? Or does he really have a long way to go in terms of bringing up the passing game to match his athleticism in the run? So that's probably one of the things that I am most looking forward to with this Griffin team.
And I want to throw it right back to you, but I want to pass it to you like this, because to move over to the defensive side of the ball, we came off that game thinking that Guelph was just kind of looking Max square in the eye and saying, we dare you to run the ball on us. We're going to put 3 defensive linemen there, and we're going to sit everyone back. We're going to get home with those 3. And, hey, Keegan Hall, best of luck. Now, they don't necessarily need to do that schematically to have success against these York Lions. But Tom, how many defensive linemen do you think Guelph will trot out in that front 7 against York nonetheless?
Yeah, something that you and I had kind of been talking about for a little while here. I kind of started cluing into it myself, even when I was listening back to the podcast, talking about the defensive ends for Guelph lining up head up or inside of the tackles here to be really aggressive with that. The only other time I've really seen a defense like that was in the old days of Windsor and Toronto, where who so happened to be the defensive coordinator? One Donovan Carter, current special teams coach for these Guelph Griffins here. So I was very, you and I kind of had a light bulb moment as soon as we started talking about that. Like, oh my goodness, like, who says you can't teach an old dog new tricks here? Obviously, Donovan Carter was talking to Coach McPhee, trying to give him all of the insights in terms of where does this team and why does this 30 front defense work for me? Why is this my bread and butter and things like that? But when you look at it, you've got issues with injuries. Now, obviously, you've got issues, like injuries all across the front 7 there. So whatever, but like you're losing out on your star defensive end in Scott Murray here. You go to Joshua Campbell, you go to Curtis Woodmansey, who are studs for you guys and being able to do that. But the other defensive end who was consistently in there was Nick Parchenko, who is a converted offensive lineman to D-line. So you've got 3 D tackles per se who are athletic and can rush the quarterback as well as stopping the run, forcing out into these offensive players that are here. So when I kind of saw that, and you and I were texting back and forth, realizing that, we went, oh, whoa, that's probably the best defense that we've seen from the Griffins all year. So is this a one-off because McMaster's and, kind of air raid offense, and this is what they want to do? Or with all of those pieces in play, do they lean into that Donovan Carter style defense, stick with your 3 big boys in defensive linemen up front, have your guys like Brandon Farrago and hopefully Anthony Martuzzo when he comes back, and have 4 linebackers there ready to fly around and do whatever else you kind of need to? So I'm very, very interested to see which defense we see, a more McPhee classic kind of style, or this, I don't want to say necessarily new age, but a new age 30 front defense that Coach Carter normally runs.
And, when we were talking about it, of course, we were reminiscing about going up against some of those defenses for Windsor in the early to mid 2010s and, talking about, kind of getting the way back machine and bringing up old Ty Pham, who was at the nose tackle. And I did do a little Googling to bring him up. Honestly, if you don't know that name, I mean, maybe he's probably got a highlight film up there somewhere. He really was a heck of a football player. And what's so incredible, going back, just pulling up his bio page, that he was holding down the middle of that 34 defense, sitting at 6'3", 270. But he was a handful in his own right. Pride of London, Ontario, Sir Wilfrid Laurier Rams, who I believe are still sitting at the top of the Ontario high school rankings. Go Rams. No, I don't say go Rams. I got South Lion blood in me. Hashtag win South. Hashtag South flu. But so really interesting development in that regard there. But what's fascinating to think about, as we were saying, not to look past your opponent or nothing like that, but they do have this game against Waterloo coming up, and then of course they get their bye week after that, and then they still have teams like Queens and Carleton. Obviously, we've talked about not necessarily the most vaunted rushing attack, but specifically with Waterloo and then Queens after their bye, where you wonder, and maybe this is where this defensive front, if it is DC just kind of whispering sweet nothings into Coach McPhee's ear of like, try a 30 front, change it up a little bit. Then maybe when they go against Waterloo, who, like we said, we liked what Anthony Miller and Quentin Springer have been doing running the ball for them, and obviously with Queens, we know what they do running the ball, where ultimately what I'm saying is this a committed change? Obviously, like we said, with York, they could play a 30 front, they could play a 4 front, they could play that weird 2 front that Ottawa used to play when we played them back in the mid 2010s with just like 5 linebackers kind of dancing around. York actually used to do, I think, what Coach McDonald would call their dancing bear front and all that weird crap that they used to do, right?
Bunch of dancing bears.
A bunch of dancing bears. God bless the York Lions. But so that's where I'm curious, is that, like we said, they can probably trot out their defense any which way they want this week, and they'll pick up the dub. It's on their homecoming. It's York, all those things. When they go up against a team like Waterloo, like Queens, even more so, will they stick to this? Is this a full change, or is this now just saying, we got a couple tricks up our sleeve for your money? Like, is it more worthwhile, or does it seem more like something that's kind of a new norm? Or maybe is this just, we're gonna just hold down the fort until we get Scott Murray back, Anthony Mortuzo back, and then maybe we can go back to Coach McPhee's defense that perhaps was more dependent on having those bodies in the mix. And of course, it doesn't seem like we're getting Christian Stewart at all this year as well, right? So like, once again, the injury bug, the missing pieces thing is not even worthwhile. It is a massive component with this team, even if, like I said, it's still just frustrating at times when, that 2-week stretch was perhaps the worst stretch of football in recent history for Guelph. But I'll leave it to you like that. Is this a full sale change, or do you think it's now just kind of adding in a new look into the mix?
Hey, I wouldn't be surprised if going into this McMaster game, that was what the game plan was. You know what? We have we have a very solid defensive coordinator still in Donovan Carter, who happens to be coaching our special teams here. Why don't we lean on his expertise a little bit, because of everybody in that team designed to try to run a 30 front. He's the guy, he's the best person to kind of talk to. And then the success that you see from there, and you have Brandon Farrigo come back, and you have your outstanding play from your 3 defensive linemen, and then Javon Jacobson does his thing. And with the idea of potentially having Anthony Martuzo back at one point, having Farrigo, Jacobson, and then Martuzo there is very, very scary. And the idea with certain times when you're running this 3-4 defense and the way that they can do this here, because the defensive ends, like I said, are either head up or inside, that leaves your will linebackers or your outside linebackers the capability of potentially rushing. So even if you have an injury like a Cole Watson who's down, or Anthony Martuzo who may not be back, you could potentially put a guy like Yusuf Khalidi, their other defensive end back there, who is fast enough to maybe just go into the flats kind of thing, but is certainly a designated pass rusher. And suddenly you're not just lining him up from defensive end and going from there, but you're blitzing him, getting him into certain stunts and twists where he potentially comes free and is up the middle here. So everything that I've seen from this kind of defense, I've seen this a couple of times. The only way that this does well is having solid guys in those 3 spots who are able to eat up double teams and still stop the run, so that you don't have offensive linemen teeing off on linebackers and the run game opens up. So far, anyways, we've seen that. Like I said before, Woodmansey, Campbell, and Parchenko they played very well against McMaster, admittedly against a struggling offensive line, but they did their jobs and they really showcased how potent this defense could be. I think they've got some new life because of that. They go into this York game, and I really think that they are going to keep with that 30 front, since that's where the majority of their success has come from throughout this entire year, even though it's only one game. I think they stay back to that, and they continue to test it out against York and try to see a little bit more. And then even going into the week after, you're playing against Waterloo, and they have something of a struggling offense as well. So you have a very strong capability here of showcasing this defense and getting some valuable game reps against a couple of teams that don't have the strongest offense. So you can afford to make a couple of mistakes here or there, clean it up in film, because obviously, or at least I would assume, that they haven't been practicing this defense, and this was something that they just kind of popped in for McMaster here, and there's a lot of moving parts. And with Donovan Carter, I know for a fact that there's so much more to that playbook that he could potentially open up. So yeah, I'm fully expecting this Guelph Griffin team to stick with this 30 front and to continue going forward here with a little bit of Coach McPhee still sprinkled in there as well, which could be very dangerous.
And I think what makes that all the more dangerous is, like we said, so they're hosting York, they hit the road for Waterloo, then they have their bye. And so, like we said, Waterloo will be the most formidable rushing team that they'll have played in this 3-week stretch, Mac, York, Waterloo, in terms of if they're sticking with that 3-man front, that kind of quasi-Donovan Carter-esque look and everything like that. And in many ways, you almost think then, hey, even more reason perhaps to stick with it against Waterloo. Like, obviously, that's a big game for Guelph because, we're obviously picking them against York here. So that means they'll be sitting at 3-2 going into that Waterloo game. The idea that they could be 4-2 going into their bye, having then Queens and Carleton at the end of the year, and, you've secured a 500 seeding at the worst case scenario. And, if this is really a rejuvenation for that defense and they're getting healthier with the bye, you can certainly say the Carleton game's a winnable game. Depending on what we see from Queens in the coming weeks, it feels a little far-fetched right now to say that could be a winnable game, but in a couple weeks might have a different tune on that. So it almost feels like, these next 2 games, like obviously they're going to beat York. Waterloo, if things keep tracking the way they are for Guelph, probably favoring them, despite what I was saying about 2 weeks ago. Going 4-2 into that, so a winnable game, but maybe you have that 30 front look against a good rushing team in Waterloo. Like I said, if it's really going to crap, you maybe put a little more beef on the line, or as you said, maybe it's just a function of staying that front, but having those outside linebackers come down, almost turning it into a 50 front all of a sudden. Even though, as we've talked about, as offensive linemen and scheming up it. Put a 50 front on the field all day. Love running on 50 fronts. But putting that aside and just to take all that information in going into the bye, as you said, you haven't really had time to perhaps look at all the different frills and all the different aspects and ways that you can tweak these things. So in many ways, like Guelph is in a phenomenal position right now. You talk about Mac coming off that game, and certainly that's going to be a game we go back to in all our offseason commentary, whatever kind of content we're putting out, of like massive turning point, because you use the turn of phrase that Mac relinquished the proverbial controlling their destiny aspect, or they may have. For Guelph, once again, assuming they don't completely fumble the bag with, a win against York coming up and then a very winnable game against Waterloo, then their bye week, this is a position where, wow, hey, things are tracking positively for Guelph right now. Though I still won't let up on that commentary that I just still feel like our alma maters are just going to torture us to no end throughout the rest of this season. But it's exciting. It's very, very interesting to see what's cooking right now in Guelph, and if that offense continues to track and the way it's going. And I mean, frankly, I don't actually have an Isaiah Smith like report on it. Obviously, the nature of it being a lower body injury to the knee looked awful. All those things. I'm assuming it's done for the year. Do you know for a fact if it is?
ACL, MCL done for the year.
I was like, grasp at my heart. You just feel for the kid. Oh my goodness, that's well. But hey, more power to Donovan Malloy. And then even if this, because at the end of the day, kind of like we were saying with Carlton, whatever those positives are, like no one in their right mind is gonna be picking Guelph over the Westerns, Windsors, Lauriers of the world, right? But then if you're coming into next year being like, we figured some things out defensively, maybe we got healthier, year 2 with the Aboud and McRae, combination there, and then all of a sudden your backfield, Smith and Malloy, 2024 could be the year of the Griffin. And we'll see who the head coach is as well, which could also be very fascinating. Tom, I'll speak for you. It's Guelph over York, obviously, in this one, correct?
Go Griffs, baby.
Go Griffs. That'll take us to our final game of the matchup. The matchup that is the reason I had to write out by hand just 2 possible standings, the lookings of the standings as we enter or as we exit week 5, because, well, in many ways, it doesn't change a heck of a lot, to be honest, but it looks fascinating because, of course, it's the Queens Golden Gales hitting the road to take on the Windsor Lancers. 4:00 start under the Golden Arches in Windsor at Alumni Field out there. Both these teams coming off of very emotional games. If I sound like a broken record, that's because, of course, exactly what I said about Western Ottawa, because those were the opponents both these teams played. Mm-hmm. In the case of Queens, it was snatching defeat out of the hands of victory. And for Windsor, it was hanging on to the win with the Storm and GGs coming back to take you out, or in their attempt to take you out. Now, for Windsor, I mean, actually, let me start with this one, because much like that other game we talked about to set this week up in general with Western hosting Ottawa, that main point of interest for me laid in the fact of Amilcar Polk being our far and above top rusher in the OUA thus far, Western's defense in the run game being so stingy, Max von Muhldorfer piece, what his injury status is, and what that's gonna produce in this one. Looking at this game, though Windsor doesn't have a single rusher, of course, that's doing what Polk is doing, though perhaps they could if they just wanted to invest more and more rushes into any part of that 3-headed monster running the ball for them. As a collective, they're leading the league, rushing for 256 yards per game on the ground. Flip side of that coin, Queens D holding teams to 121 rush yards per game. I'm going to start you off with that one. And they held Western, albeit to 150 themselves in that game. So I'm going to start you with a similar question on this one. What do you think gives from that standpoint? Do we see Queens defense bend a little bit more in terms of some yardage they give up on the ground? Or do we see a week where maybe when Windsor's rushing game stifles a little bit? And frankly, as we said, Ottawa did a pretty good job of doing just that. But this is where we're starting to see Danny Skelton put together his own MVP case for the year, where it's like, you know what, whether they need to or not, whether it's a function of another team slowing down their run game, hey, give number 7 the rock and let him cook. He's got some great receivers out there, and he's one of the top dogs in this league. Starting from that run game perspective, what do you see kind of giving?
Based off of everything that I've seen here, and regardless, you can't count out this Windsor rushing attack. It is really outstanding. Like you said, leading the league. It's something you have to account for. In this game, Queens' defense comes through, and the rushing does not go where it needs to be for these Windsor Lancers. If Windsor wants to come away with a win here, it has to come on the arm of Danny Skelton. I think that everything that I've seen from this Queens defense, I really love how they played against Western, despite the fact that, yes, Keon Edwards does finish with 130 yards on the ground. That's just another day for Keon there. My thing is that Keon Edwards is obviously outstanding at what he does. Keanu Yazbek, while only getting 4 attempts, 7 yards rushing. Like, I don't know. I'm very high on this Queens rushing defense. I think they did a very solid job against Western. I think that they did a very good job against Laurier in week 1. Obviously doing everything that they did there. Now, Laurier looked really impressive with the connection between Taylor Elgersma and Braden Thorne and Ethan Jordan very early on there, but very much bend, don't break kind of defense. Laurier didn't get into the end zone through the air in that game. So I think that this Queens defense is going to show out here. I think that Windsor still has success on the ground, don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a little bit more of what we saw with this Ottawa team. You know, that's still a number of attempts. Joey Zorn and Christopher John. Joey Zorn 15 attempts, Christopher John 12 attempts, but Zorn finishes with 60 yards and John finishes with 42. I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that once again. And like I said, if Windsor's going to win this game, it has to come on the arm of Danny Skelton. This is his coming out party and showcasing, we know that this run game is really good. Danny, how good are you?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you talked as well after the Ottawa game that Windsor O-line is very good, but there may be areas where you can attack them, and Queens with Van Wishart rushing the quarterback certainly presents a lot of challenges for teams. Switching over to the offense for Queens and looking at that matchup with this Windsor defense, you know, we were so fascinated with how Queens seemingly game planned against Western, where you get Anthony Souls back, and you know, obviously you've had Jared Kasari doing his thing so far this year, having some pretty solid production, yet still Vreekin throws the rock 45 times. And it's not a circumstance, as we've said, where you're down just a big old pile and you got to throw it. That was how they were just clearly wanting to move the ball. Now, maybe part of that is, you're bringing Souls back into the fold. And maybe, as we've kind of talked about with some of these teams, at the end of the day, maybe they do see their fortunes, their most success kind of coming at the arm of Vreekin and just trying to get that established and whatnot. But that's perhaps the thing I'm most interested to see in this one, where, it'll be the week 2 having Souls and Kasari back, and no doubt having them that much better just in terms of the flow of the offense and everything like that. But, the Vreekin 45 attempts still kind of mystifies me. Not that I don't think he's good enough to receive that type of attention in their passing game, just in their offense in general, I should say. But how do you see that breaking down for Queens when they're looking at how they can perhaps attack Windsor? Because you could make the case at the least that, not that I think Queens would ever be second guessing their running capabilities, but if you're looking at, okay, we're going up against Western, we might have a little more success passing it than we're going to have rushing the ball. I mean, Western's, like I said, their rushing stats only giving up 51 yards a game kind of validates that. So maybe it's just purely a function of that, but I think it is slightly more than that. And like I said, I don't think, I feel like you could put the steel curtain Pittsburgh Steelers out there, and it's Queens football. They're still going to be like, well, we should still run the ball though, right? Like that was still so very interesting. What do you make of it in this game? Certainly very interesting. I think, in my opinion here, I think we see more rushing, or at least more of a balanced rushing attack against this Windsor team than we do Vreekin passing the ball. I don't think that has anything to do with Alex Vreekin and his capabilities. I still think that he is a very strong quarterback in the league here. But like you pointed out, I think last week, a couple of weeks ago, which team leads the league in sacks this year? It's still Windsor, but it's actually much closer now after what Laurier did last week. But yeah, still Windsor.
It's still Windsor. So Yes, I think that this Windsor defense is legit. I think that they pass rush with some of the best of them, obviously leading the league right now. But with that, I think we see more from Souls. I think we see more from Kasari, and just balancing this attack that's here. I don't know that I don't think that they're going to have the success that we've come to see from Souls and Kasari, but I think we see a little bit more from them going into this game to try to balance out and once again keep that defense a little honest here and try to keep Vrikin upright. Alex Vrikin, like you look at the stats and sure, game against Western, 26 for 45, 358 yards, a touchdown, 2 picks. Like I still don't think that this is the level of quarterback play that we are capable of seeing from Alex Vrikin. I still think that he's got more that he could show us here. And for whatever reason, he's struggled a little bit and he's still kind of working this stuff out here. But I think that with those things in mind, I think they stick a little bit more to the run game here to try and get Windsor out of that and just to go a little bit more balanced. Vrikin is still going to have to come in and obviously play a big factor, but ain't no way he's throwing 45 times against these Windsor Lancers.
It'll certainly be surprising, even though he's coming off the game where he literally just did that. But here's the follow-up thing I'm curious about, because as I was saying, I was kind of jotting down, I feel very confident about our picks in all these other games. This is the one where I've had much more deliberation of kind of flip-flopping a little bit of like, well, could it be this? Could it be that? And going back to week 1, we've highlighted games where we're like, this is a playoff game. Your commentary, like as you said off of last week's Mac Guelph game, was Guelph came in being like, this is our season on the line, and Mac was just sitting around waiting for someone to make a play. Funny enough, somewhat regardless of how this game shakes out, the standings will likely look the same in terms of just pure seeding. But there's a very, very real chance that coming off of this week, the Queens, well, I'll say it like this. There's a very likely chance that Queens is still 7th in the OUA after this week, win or loss. But there's a big difference when you look at those standings and you see them at 1-3 versus 2-2. And much like you said with Mac, they could have easily won that Laurier game. Like easily in the standpoint of it was there for the winning. They certainly could have won the Western game. We know that for sure. And, go back to the commentary that Jack Moore passed along to you about how they opted to not go for the 2-point convert, whatever, right? All those things, right? They could very easily be sitting at 3-0 right now. But coulda, woulda, shoulda doesn't do you a heck of a lot if if week 5 is wrapping up and you're sitting at 1-3 in the standings. And so I guess I want to add this to the mix. We've talked about the impact of travel, and I still can't wait till whenever we decide to kind of talk and discuss about that whole super conference idea and everything and anything that kind of comes with that conversation. You have a Windsor team where, there's a lot of things that we want to see them clean up off that Ottawa game. There's still that piece on the penalties. But at the end of the day, you know what? Hey, you picked up the win. You're sitting at 5-0. Like, you got to be feeling good about yourself. And you know that there's a team now coming into your house with a big travel, coming off of a very emotional loss at home that is, whether they'd want to admit it at Queens, they are desperate for this win. They need this win. And I feel like if you're Windsor, obviously you want to win this game. You certainly can win this game, no doubt at all. But I feel like, and it depends on, your philosophy in sports and coaching and all that. But I actually, part of me slides the part of my calculus Windsor's direction of the fact that they're kind of there. They're sitting in Win City right now being like, prepping for this game like all heck, like it's the Yates Cup, like it's the Vanier, just like any good program is going to do. You take every game, as Coach Gallo used to say, and it's a turn of phrase I've certainly borrowed in my own coaching life. This is the most important game because it's the next game. And that mentality, I think, is something that like all good athletes and all good coaches do impart in their preparation. But the fact that they're kind of just at home chilling, prepping for this game, they're sleeping in their own beds, they're getting ready, they're feeling high and mighty at 5-0. People are starting to talk about them. Their song is being sung over and over again. People are loving what they're doing. They're sacking quarterbacks. Kaladi Amusin is at the top of the rankings. He's going to be a guy we certainly have to talk about in DPOY conversations. They got other guys doing their thing on that defense. Obviously, the offense can get you in every which way. And this team from Kingston is coming in, perhaps clenching a little bit. How do you feel that factor, that more sort of mental, more intangible aspect may play into this? Because certainly there's a case to be made that actually, you know what, Queens is going to ride that energy and come in here and maybe, kick them in the teeth a little bit.
I love that that's where you went with this, because that's exactly where I was planning on going with my next chance at talking here. So same wavelength, brother. It's very interesting to me for exactly that reason, in the kind of mentality that both of these teams are coming into this. With everything that I know about the Don and Coach Cercelli here, no way, shape, or form does he allow this Windsor Lancer team to think we're the best in the OUA. We don't have to come out and prove it every single time. They're riding this underdog narrative all the way to, even if they were to win a Yates Cup, no, we're still the underdogs here. I think that they're going through that entire process exactly like that. And I don't think they want to think that they're the better team here. I think they want to go into every game thinking that nobody thinks that we can do this outside of the people wearing blue and yellow. Like that's it. So I really think that this Windsor team is going to come out firing like this. And when you look at Queens, based off of where they've been in the past couple of years to where they are now, that mentality is, guys, what the hell is going on here? We shouldn't be where we are. Like, there's a very strong possibility that they should be 3-0 going into this, and they're not. They're 1-2 or 1-3. So yeah, I think that there is a very, very different mindset going into this game here. And I think that makes a huge difference. How can Steve Snyder come through and get his Gales back on track and make sure that they recognize the fact that, yeah, we lost a couple of games. This is big time here. We got to come out and start firing and play Gales football like we have been the past couple of years if we want to get back on track and make sure that we are reaching our goals that we set out at the beginning of the year. So vastly different mentalities going into this one.
Absolutely. And we joked about this on the last podcast. So I'm asking this rhetorically because though I sometimes throw questions your way, out of the blue, I know the answer on this one or know where I'm going with this. But as far as just individuals who certainly enjoy seeing the Golden Gales pick up a loss, Tom, who is an individual that you already mentioned his name, that we talk about quite a bit, who was on that Western sideline for that fantastic 09 Yates?
The Don, baby.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm sure there's no love lost whether he's wearing Western purple, Windsor blue and yellow, or however they specifically, I don't know, maybe there's a specific color code or name for those colors and everything like that. The one thing though, and frankly, I think this is my last comment on it, that I just still, once again, as far as the big picture of this OUA season, thinking about playoffs, thinking about Yates Cups, thinking about all those things that I just do want to clean up. We've talked about it. I think we talked about it last year going back with this team too, during their sort of rise to prominence to kind of where they are now, is the penalties. And, actually by the numbers on the OUA stats page, I actually, this is kind of funny because a couple weeks ago, as you brought up, talked about the sacks and everything like that. Somewhat rhetorical. Tom, who do you think leads the league in penalties right now?
that would be the Windsor Lancers.
It most certainly would. Now, I'll add a caveat to this because it doesn't seem like Queens' stats have been updated in terms of penalties given up. But when I look, because it only shows them having 2 games worth of penalties from so far in the year. And it looks like they picked up 8 in their game against Western. So, okay, I can do a little bit of math there and add that to their total. But Windsor's currently sitting 13 penalties above the second highest penalized team in Waterloo. They have 53 penalties. They're averaging 13 a game. They're giving up on average 116 yards per game. They're giving up a touchdown's worth of yards in penalties. And that's just something where I don't know. Like as a coach, as a player, you can chalk that up to a number of things, but those are controllables. And it's just, it's frustrating, certainly for no one more than Coach Cercelli himself, to see that happening. And that is one of the things that, as we now get into the dog days of the season for Windsor in specific, like we said, with, even including the game against Ottawa, which, you give Ottawa credit for the comeback, but that Lecandro to Mahler to Gendron touchdown, yeah, it's a trick play, massive bust. No one was close to Gendron when he caught it, and he literally slow jogged it into the end zone, right? You don't love that. They have this game against Queens. They got Windsor. They got the bye. They got Laurier. They finished off with York, which frankly I don't love finishing off the season with York. If you're Windsor, if I'm being completely honest, but these are the games now where those penalties, those mistakes, those errors in whatever form or fashion they come in, might have almost cost you a game in Ottawa, right? We kind of questioned some of the play calling things from Ottawa, but they were right in that game at the end of it. And now here we go. As we always said, if you want to beat Western, you have to have your perfect game. They're not going to beat themselves. You have to bring the ruckus. Queens, Laurier, obviously, as we said, Queens a bit of a off year from what we expected, but they've been in these games. They could be undefeated. We wouldn't be surprised at all. These are the times where those penalties can really come to hurt you. But I do think that perhaps goes in with that mentality they're going to have of like if you guys are reading your press clippings, if you're staring at that 5-0 thing, feeling fat and happy with where we are right now, we haven't won ish this year yet. So that's sort of my last thought on that. I don't know. What do you think about that aspect of it?
Yeah, certainly. You have to make sure that you're limiting the mistakes as best you can. I think that we talked about it before. This Windsor Lancer team really plays with their heart on their sleeve. I think they're a very emotional team. They believe in Coach Cercelli, and they get up and they stay up against in every game that we've seen so far. But with that comes the emotions that, hey, I'm not going to allow somebody to get a last second cheap shot against my guy. I'm not going to allow something like this to happen. I'm going to speak up. I'm going to start saying something. And I'm going to start reacting to that. And doing something like that hurts your team. It really does. And it's something that needs to be cleaned up. However, a little fun fact for you, my friend.
Let's go.
So these Windsor Lancers, in all of youth sports right now, dead last in penalty yards. Do you know who else was dead last in penalty yards that had a pretty good season? And I think if I say the year, I'm going to give it away. So I'm just going to say it. The 2011 McMaster Marauders in the regular season, over 1,050 penalty yards in 8 games. I think we had a pretty good year. It's still possible to do something with that, but you got to be damn good if you're going to make up for those mistakes. It's a lot better if you just don't make those mistakes, but it's been done before.
Do off-field shenanigans add into the penalty mix, perhaps at the hands of your quarterback at the time? No,
they don't add
Kyle
in.
Quinlan didn't get that didn't count. Okay, all right, that's fine. Hey, obviously, at the end of the day, you don't love it, but those are things that are separate from the actual just football they are playing. As you said, it's one of those things where, to make a cross-sport analogy, think about someone in the NBA, someone like Draymond Green, where it's like you have to accept the fact that like he is going to cross the line every now and then, or like someone like Dylan Brooks, not to compare their careers, obviously, with Draymond being a multi-time NBA champion, but that like you take the good with the supposed bad in that situation. But I do think that's no doubt something that Coach Urselli is harping on. It's not going to stand, but great point you bring up in that one. Tom, I'm so curious where you're going with this one. I almost want to like give us a countdown and we yell out our pick like at the same time. Do we try this one? Do we see how this works?
Sure.
This is gonna sound terrible when we both just like blurt out something. It's gonna just sound like blah 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 in a second. All right, let's see how this goes. All right, 3, 2, 1. Windsor. Oh, okay. Yay! Go Lancers. How exciting. This reminds me when you, Nate, and I all picked the Huskies in the Vanier.
An honorary from Nate.
Somewhere Nate Hobbs is barking like a dog. That dog he is. Love you, Nate. Beautiful. Hey, you know what? The great thing, Tom, is that obviously we said, as we've said, we're hitting that meaty part of the season. These teams are really taking shape. They're really hitting their stride. And even in the games that are on paper, are at first glimpse not as exciting, there's something to, I don't even want to say tease out of these things. There's so much great talent. There's so many great stories here. Last word to you, Tom, as far as the thing you're most excited for, just any commentary as we get set for what will surely be another exciting weekend of OUA football.
Yeah, my last comments that I have here is just finishing up on our the last game that you and I both agreed to, these Queens against Windsor. This is the game that officially puts Windsor on the map and says to everybody else in the OUA, we're legit. We are the team to look out for here. It's Western, it's Laurier, and damn it, it's the Lancers. It's not the Gales that you need to be looking out for here. I think that while it is true about what I said, I think that this Windsor rushing attack is not as successful as we've used to kind of been seeing here. This is Danny Skelton's game. Danny goes off. He showcases that he's got the capabilities to take over a game here when the rushing attack isn't where it needs to be. And I think he really does a lot of special things here to vault him in, a little bit more of the top 5 in terms of not even top 5, top 3, top 2 in all of OUA quarterback play. This is Skelton's game.
It really is. Like, who would have thunk it that we'd be going into this game thinking that it's Vreeken, it's Skelton, seemingly competing for that third spot in the, if you want to call it, your top 3 quarterback rankings as we hit the midseason. We'll obviously talk about those rankings next week. And when you look at the U Sports rankings as they came out just yesterday, being the 19th, obviously us recording here on the 20th, where in those rankings they have Queens sitting at 10, they have Windsor going at 8. So, though I'm not terribly surprised that we aligned on that Windsor pick, it obviously aligns with where other people are seeing these Lancers right now. Maybe Coach Urselli's blocked the U Sports page from all of his players' web pages, so they can't even look at that and get any more excited. But if I got any more excited, I might grow some hair. So I can't wait to check out these games. Like we said, Tom and I are deliberating about maybe trying to grab tickets for Laurier Homecoming, though, of course, that's a stadium that's already somewhat limited in terms of its capacity, and Homecoming makes it that much more. It's likely then if we do get to a game, it'll be Guelph hosting York, though, of course, that is Guelph's homecoming as well. It just obviously seats more people. So we're going to post this podcast on Thursday. We decided, hey, you know what? We run pretty well 2 hours on all these pods. You need your time to listen to them, to think about your own thoughts. Hopefully we present an even balanced perspective on these teams. So whatever thoughts you have, whatever bias that you have, and hey, we all have biases with these teams, no matter where they come from, it gives you time to process it as you go into the weekend. But yeah, if you're going to be at the Guelph game, because that does seem like where we'll end up if we do end up at a game, let us know. Give us a shout out when you're there. It'd be great to connect with you. As always, thank you so much for connecting with with us, whether it's on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, hitting us up, DMs, just messaging us, and all that stuff, and just consuming our content, however it is you are consuming our content. So, Tom, hopefully I get to see your beautiful face this weekend. I know at the very least we'll be blowing up each other's phones as we always do all weekend long. And I can't wait to talk to you about all these games and much more next week at the 55.